Hi, it's time for a chime video. So what we have on the workbench today is a quartet of NuTone 8-note bar chimes. And these are all exactly the same model, well, except for that one, and we'll get to that in a minute. They all fundamentally the same design, but they span a wide range of manufacturing dates, and there are differences between each and every one of them. So let's set the stage a little bit. It's around 1947, and NuTone has wrapped up its wartime production and is getting back to the business of making door chimes again. Now, since their attention was focused, like almost all manufacturers, on wartime production, they didn't have a lot of new designs ready to go. So they had to use some of the design aspects of their earlier chimes on their new chimes because they needed to get back into business again. Around 1947, they introduced the K series of chimes, or what we call the K model chimes. Now, NuTone people, we all think of K model chimes as being 1950s chimes. However, the chimes that were made in 1947, 1948, and 49, they are also K model chimes. That's what NuTone called them. But their components and designs relate back to the pre-war chimes that they made, and they are dramatically different than anything that was made starting around 1950. So what do we have here on the workbench? What is our quartet of chimes? These are all Model K40 chimes, except for this one. This one's an L40, and that's one special, and we'll get to that in a bit. A K40 is called a Symphonic, and it's an 8-note bar chime. And this particular one here, this is the oldest one. This is probably 1947 or 1948. And this is a K40, and it's probably from somewhere around 1953. And this is a K40 chime, and it's from 1955. And this one down here actually is a Model L41, because NuTone renamed it, and it's from either September of 1957 or perhaps February of 1957, because it's got two date codes on it. This is an L model chime. L model chimes came out after K model chimes, and NuTone people, we think of L model chimes as being 1960s chimes, but for many of the different models, they actually started to introduce them around 1957. And that's where this one fits in. If you look closely, you'll see they are all fundamentally the same. However, they all have their own unique differences. We'll start with the bottom plates here. They're all brass. This one has a more decorative perforated design to it. This one is also decorative. However, the perforations are gone. And this one are pretty much the same. They're much smaller, and they simply say NuTone, and all the fancy decorations are gone. These could all simply be style choices that they made as they designed it and updated it, or it also could be that it was a way to save costs a little bit as the model aged over time, and there were newer models, and perhaps sales on these were dropping off, and they were looking to save a few pennies here and there wherever they could. They each have two large brass resonator tubes, and they each have 4 tone bars. So they are true 4 or 8-note Westminster chimes. However, they are special Westminster chimes, unlike any other chime NuTone made at the time. These were all available with 2 different types of covers that you could order, and I have an example of one of the covers. This is the cover in what's called limed oak, and it's a light colored faux wood grain with a nice emblem in the middle here, and it was also available in a dark walnut with an emblem. The earliest one here, the color choices for the cover were the same. However, it didn't have the round medallion. It had a highly stylized musical note on the front of it to remind you that it was a musical chime. So let's put this aside, and let's take a look at each individual one, and then I'll point out some of the differences, and you can see how the design changed over time. So this is our late 1940s K40 chime, and as you can see, it's missing the motor. The thing that makes this one most unique compared to the other 3 is that this uses a design that was from pre-war chimes. It uses a completely different type of motor assembly. It has a completely different type of contact assembly on the back, more reminiscent of the long tube chimes that NuTone made before and after the war. It also uses the unusual design on the solenoids and plungers where the springs are located at the back of the plunger and they're clipped onto it, so they are extension springs. When the solenoid is energized, the plunger shoots out and the springs attach to the back of the plunger so it stretches out, and then when the solenoid shuts off, the spring pulls the plunger back in. That was an interesting design. I think it was less than successful, and that's one of the reasons that they moved away from it. The other thing on this one is you do have a volume control here. The knob is connected to a rheostat on the back of the chime, so you can adjust how hard the plungers strike the tone bars. This would be considered just simply a two-door chime because you have the standard 4-connection terminal strip here where you have blue, red, yellow, and green wires, 2 for the transformer and 1 for the front door button and 1 for the rear door button. So it's 4 or 8 notes for the front door and a single note for the rear door. If we move to the right, we have our K40 from around 1953, and you can see, even though it has this motor, it is somewhat different than the first one. Oh, I should point out on this one's missing a solenoid right here also. So this one has given up some of its parts for other chimes. So here we have a later style Telecron motor assembly, and it uses a different style of contact switchboard behind it. You can't really see it because the cover's still on it. It's a simplified design that I think was probably less expensive to manufacture and was also ultimately more reliable, because the ones with the rotating discs, if everything isn't aligned correctly, and I think if you have a certain amount of wear and tear, they become difficult to have operate correctly. These are much more reliable in their design. They also have changed over to the later style of solenoid and plunger assemblies where the spring is in front of the plunger. So when the plunger is energized, it compresses the spring, and then when it shuts off, the spring expands and pushes the plunger back in. And that was a much more reliable design. One of the other changes, which is a little hard to see, is right here. If you look at the terminal block assembly, if we pull this old cloth covered wire out of the way, you can see here you have more connections. You have a common connection and a transformer connection, which is where the wires from the transformer go, and then you have the front door connection, which is 4 or 8 notes, a second door connection, which is 2 notes, and a third door connection, which is 1 note. So now the chime has become a 3-door chime, so you have front door, rear door, and side door. And you can choose which notes play for which door. One of the things that was interesting at this time in the early 1950s was, I think, in the world of door chimes, because there were other manufacturers also making door chimes at that time. It was the new fancy product to have in your house. So to keep up with other manufacturers, they were looking for new innovative ideas that they could build into the chimes that would make theirs stand out from other manufacturers. A lot of manufacturers made 3-door chimes. NuTone made 3-door chimes also, but normally what you would have on a chime, an 8-note chime, would be 4 or 8 notes for the front door, a single note for the side door, and a different single note for the rear door. And what NuTone was trying to do with these chimes is give you a 4 or 8 note for the front door, 2 notes for the rear door, and 1 note for the side door design. So it distinguishes it differently because it's easier to distinguish between 2 notes that rings and a single note that rings, as opposed to 2 different single notes. And what they did with this design was, down here under this plate, I'm going to take this screw out. There's actually a switch right here. There's a little reed switch right here, and this plunger on the bottom solenoid, the plunger actually is exposed on the back side of the solenoid. The spring is clipped into a groove on the plunger, and when it energizes, it shoots forward and hits the tone bar, and when the spring makes it shoot back, it would pop back out towards the left and hit the reed switch here, and that would cause the second note for the rear door chime. I'm assuming that it was a less than successful design because it doesn't seem to carry on for more than a year or so before it's changed again, and that's how we move on to the next chime over here. So here we have our K40 from 1955, and it's very, very similar to the 1953 chime. The primary difference has to do with the switch assembly for the second note on the rear door. They've done away with the exposed plunger and the externally mounted spring connected to it, and what they've done is they've elongated the solenoid tube so the plunger, I think, stays more aligned, and the spring is moved back to the front of the plunger, so when the solenoid is de-energized, the spring pushes the plunger back and it hits the reed switch and makes the second note. Again, I don't think it was that successful because by the time you get to 1957, you start to see different designs to create two notes for the rear door, and that's how we move on to our L model chime. And let's talk about our little L model chime for a bit. This is our L41 chime. Now, the L41 chime is still called a symphonic, and in fact, I have here a little sales brochure. This is from 1958, actually. But here, on the inside page, we have an L41 Symphonic right there. And it says 8 or 4 chord chimes, walnut or lime oak finish cover, gold anodized tubes, 2 chords for rear door, 1 note for the third door. Includes the transformer. And in 1958, it cost $36.95, which was quite a lot, because if you look up here in the brochure, you could buy a model L12, which is called the Champion, and it's a plastic cover, white or silver, 2 notes for the front door, 1 note for the rear door. This would be your basic entry-level builder door chime, and it only cost $4.95, which was still a lot of money in those days. But even so, instead of doing that, you could step way up to $36.95. And this was one of the more expensive chimes. The most expensive chime in here, of course, is the L46, which is the Jefferson, or the L47, which is called the Century. And those were $89.95 or $79.95. So you have to have some serious coin to afford a chime like this back in those days. This is a unique L41 chime. In fact, it even has 2 different date code stamps on it. The top date code says February 1957, and the bottom one is September 1957. So why was it date coded twice? I don't have any idea. It could be that it was intended to start off life as a K40 chime, and then by the time you get towards 1957, the early L model chimes were being introduced, and perhaps when they stamped out the chassis that everything is attached to, maybe they date stamped it at that point. Or maybe it had been partially assembled, maybe the resonator tubes and the tone bars had been attached, but it wasn't completely assembled yet. And then they made the changeover to begin to do L model chimes, and they thought, no, we're going to make this one more modern and up to date, and it was transformed from an K40 to an L41. I don't really know, that's all lost to history, but it is very decisively an L model chime. In this closer up view, if you look at the motors between the 1955 K40 and the 1957 L41, you'll see that the motors appear to be exactly the same. However, they're not precisely the same. They are actually different Telecron motor part numbers. Also, the switching assembly underneath the L41 down in here is completely different, and it's the new printed circuit board type contact assembly with the rotating contact rotor assembly that wipes across the contacts on the circuit board to make the chime sequence, and that's a completely different design than the K model chimes. These are changes that were introduced on L model chimes, and it's what makes L model chimes decisively different than K model chimes. If you look at the terminal block assembly, we still have our same 5 connections. We have common and transformer for our power. We have 4 or 8 notes for the front door, 2 notes for the rear door, and 1 note for the side door. However, the switch assembly that provides the second note for the rear door connection has been moved from down here to up here at the top. And also, the switching assembly is completely different. Gone is the reed switch that the plunger bumps into to make it close and make the connection. And now we have this encased switch design on the back of the plunger, and these, which you only see in L model chimes starting in, say, 1957 through maybe 1959, are not the most reliable design that there ever was. The little Bakelite body here on the back of the solenoid assembly has a completely unique type of plunger assembly, and again, I think it was probably less than successful because they don't generally work very well, and you see it gone after, say, 1959. I think they gave up on it and moved on to other ideas for rear and side door chimes. One of the things that's interesting about the K40 and L41 chimes is how is it designed actually to be installed? By its basic design, it always has seemed to me that it was designed to sit on something like it's sitting here on the workbench. Now, it does have a keyed slot here, so it could be hung on the wall. However, the bottom of the chime is rather large and not particularly decorative with its exposed screw heads and so forth. However, perhaps tastes were different in those days, and it would be acceptable to put something like that on the wall. But to me, it always seemed like a chime that was designed to sit on something, although there are some chimes that are what I call mantle chimes, which you don't see very often. I don't particularly know if this was one of those or not. One thing that I neglected to point out that's different between the earliest and the latest symphonic chimes are on the 1953 chime and the 1955 chime, they still have a volume control, and it's this sliding lever that allows you to adjust it from off to soft to loud. But by the time we get to the L41 chime here, the volume adjustment is gone, and so it only rings at the volume that the plungers strike at, no more adjustment. I think that probably was also a cost-saving measure, because I think by 1957, maybe through 1959, sales on this model were starting to dwindle off. And one of the things I have here is, we looked at the little brochure here from 1958, and the L41 is in there. But then I have another little pamphlet brochure here. This came from the Englewood Electrical Supply Company in South Bend, Indiana. And this is dated 1963. And if we did a quick, this is a miniature full-line counter catalog. Has some of all the different products that NuTone made at that time. And if we go back here to the back of the pamphlet, where the door chimes are located, you can go through and look through all the different models that were available at that time. However, what you won't see is an L41 Symphonic. So by 1963, it's not in the catalog, and since the catalogs probably take the better part of a year to get ready to produce, I'm going to say that probably sometime between 1960 and 1961, the L41 was discontinued. And usually products are discontinued because sales are beginning to drop off. These are unique chimes. They are very nice sounding chimes. One of the things which I read to you, and if you were paying close attention to it in the little sales brochure, it describes it as an 8 or 4 chord chime. So what's a chord chime? There's some debate about chords, and I actually looked this up, not being a musical person. And for most people, if you say, I'm going to play a chord, say on a guitar or perhaps a piano, I'm not sure about that, you always envision that it's 3 notes played together. However, there seems to be some debate about how many notes you have to have played together to make it actually a chord. In the world of NuTone chimes, it's 2 notes. So how does that work? How do you get 2 notes to play as a chord in a door chime? Well, our little L41 here, which actually belongs to a customer. He sent it to me for repair. It belonged to a good friend of his, and he wants to get it restored and install it in his house to remind him of his good friend. It's been repaired and restored, and it's now in working condition again, and I'm pretty sure you'd all like to hear how it sounds. So let me move the other ones off the workbench, and let's take a little listen to our L41 chime from 1957. So I've zoomed in as close as I can and still let you see the 4 solenoids. So we've got 1, 2, 3, and 4. If you watch really carefully, you might just be able to see the little white plunger tips pop out of the ends of each solenoid before they strike the tone bars. Now, in most NuTone 4 or 8 note chimes, what you have is each plunger pops out individually and strikes its tone bar in the correct order to create a Westminster chime sound. This one's different than that. This one has 2 plungers that pop out together for each individual note that it's going to ring to give it a richer, fuller chord type sound. So let's go ahead and ring it, and you watch really carefully and see, maybe you can see the little plunger tips pop out. And that's what makes a K40 symphonic or an L41 symphonic different and more special than most 4 or 8 note NuTone chimes. Now, it is a bar chime, and personally, I like the bar chimes. I think they always have a nice, pleasant sound. Let's give it a listen again. And that's pretty good. Chord note chimes have a special sound to them. They're different than other NuTone door chimes because with the chord design, you get a much different, fancier sound to it. And there you have it, an overview of early NuTone K model chimes throughout history, from about 1947 through, say, 1957. I hope you found this interesting, and perhaps for some of you it will be helpful. If it is, give it a thumbs up on YouTube, because that always helps. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell, and when you click on the bell, click on it to receive all notifications. And every time we post a new video, you'll get a notification and you can watch it. That's all for today. See you on the next video.